Hi, everybody. Welcome to our last lecture in Module 4, where we're talking about globalization. So, today we're going to kind of build on what we learned in class on Tuesday in terms of linguistic crossing, code switching, and the kind of politics of language to talk about the ways in which new technologies are enabling the flow of hip hop across a kind of global platform in a way that hasn't been the case for other music genres in the past. So let's get into it. For many African rappers, hip hop is an African art born in West Africa, but has been brought up in America and now has returned home. According to Canadian rapper Kanan, hip hop is rooted in a long oral tradition from West Africa, which uses drums and talking in a blues fashion to kind of communicate complex stories and personal narratives. Hip hop goes beyond just this kind of oral tradition, but when we think about it in the US context, refers to a much broader culture that includes rapping, but also goes beyond music to include things like DJing, breakdancing, graffiti writing, theater, literature, and what Cornell West calls postural semantics, basically our body language and attitude. The elements of hip hop come together or they came together during the economic downturn of the 1970s, specifically in the Bronx. DJ Kool Herc is credited with throwing the switch on this cultural genre at an August 1973 dance bash where he spun the same record on twin turntables, toggling between them to isolate and extend percussion breaks, which are the most danceable sections of any song. DJs throughout the Bronx picked up on what Herc's technique was, and this became a core feature of hip hop, this emulation and imitation of genius, and then the injection of your personal style into it. From its epicenter in the Bronx, hip hop has rolled outward to become a multi-billion-dollar business with a multinational audience. Indeed, there's now hardly a country in the world that doesn't feature some form of rap music, from the hip hop and rap scenes of France to the suave rap of Tanzania and all the way to Surinamese rap in Holland. So for today, we're actually primarily going to not talk about US hip hop because I'm assuming that everybody has some familiarity with that, but we're really going to focus on these more global flows of hip hop. And to get you guys thinking about that, I want to pose the question of how has hip hop influenced global popular culture and language? So if you're at home watching this, go ahead and write down some thoughts. In class, we'll talk about this in small groups. So the flow of popular culture reflects the unevenness of global relations. In reference to rap music, trends have historically flowed from English speaking markets rather than to it. For example, ethnomusicologist Jacqueline Erla has shown that unequal relations between the US record industry and Basque radical music mean that Public Enemy's message reaches one of the big hip hop bands in Spain called the Murgaza Brothers. But Murgaza Brothers music never really comes to the US and influences the US hip hop scene. So there's an unequal flow of US influence to these other countries and not the same sort of cultural mixing going the other way around. As hip hop has spread, the medium has been reworked to fit different local contexts and countries where strong local currents of hip hop indigenization, so to speak, have taken place. For example, there's emerged an overlapping kind of pan-Pacific hip hop network that bypasses the border and restrictions of the pop music distribution industry. For example, the group Sudden Rush has developed a style of Hawaiian hip hop that uses a kind of cut and mix of African and Jamaican reggae rhythms with Hawaiian indigenous chanting practices, as well as subversive rapping in English and the Hawaiian language. While the US may be less influenced by kind of external changes in global hip hop, Countries like France, with a very different social history of immigration, are far more influenced by the diverse francophone world which inhabits urban environments throughout the country. The French language hip hop scene has been one of the most significant for 20 years. Paris, as well as other southern port cities like Marseille, became central hubs for this kind of multi ethnic hip hop genre during the 1980s and 90s. Hip hop in France developed in what's called the banlieues, which is these kind of suburban housing projects where many poor people live. And also, these banlieues have a kind of large immigrant population from the Maghreb, which includes countries like Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, as well as former French colonies like Mali, Senegal, and Gabon, the French Antilles like Martinique and Guadeloupe, as well as other European immigrants from Portugal, Romania, Italy, etc. Rap in France uses a street speak version of French that includes African, Arab, and English roots and is viewed kind of with disapproval from traditional language speakers who really kind of um, look down on the fact that this street speak disregards kind of standard rules of grammar and incorporates a lot of slang. So while the various immigrants into France have greatly influenced French hip hop, this francophone genre of music has also changed the music scene of other regions across the world. The term francophone is generally used to refer to places and people whose first language is French. Encompasses France as well as its former colonies in Africa, North America, and the Caribbean. These music scenes are connected through a kind of post colonial use of French today. The languages and cultures that circulate within these francophone flows are constantly mixed with other languages and cultures, so that new mixtures arrive in new places and are remixed once again as they become relocalized in different places. For example, in Libreville in Gabon, rappers mixed English, French, and local languages such as Fangé and Teke. In Gabonese hip hop, English is never used on its own, but always in conjunction with French. In contrast, vernacular languages like Fangé or Teke may be used on their own or with French, but are never combined with English. The French that is used in Gabon hip hop draws on a non standard form of French slang referred to as verlan. Verlan is this kind of complex linguistic mix formed from multilingual and multicultural mixes of immigrants from all over North Africa, West Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. The choices that rappers make in terms of which languages to use and which combinations of languages to use can deliberately emphasize one aspect of their identity while also challenging others. So let's take the case of Gabon again. The use of vernacular languages signals a clear identification with a Gabonese community, while at the same time it keeps a kind of distance from France, which is perceived as kind of economically exploitative, culturally assimilative, and as a former colonizer. By putting Gabonese culture on a public and perhaps even international stage, Gabonese rap is also bringing about a kind of renewed respect and appreciation for vernacular African languages, which had previously been seen as backwards by the former French colonizers. Montreal is another part of the francophone hip hop circuit, which has a kind of different localized history of hip hop. Montreal's location in North America makes African American English both easily available and rejectable on the hip hop scene. Its location within the province of Quebec, which has a long kind of rich history of French and Francophone culture, makes it really different from other Francophone countries and music scenes. Montreal's hip hop scene is also influenced by immigrant populations with various connections to French. While immigrants from Mali, Senegal, and Gabon find a space for their French in places like Montreal, Africans from non Francophone nations may often identify more with Black English, as their African identities are kind of stripped away in favor of identification more broadly as Black rather than as African. The larger Haitian population in Montreal has forged a kind of new relationship with Haitian Creole and other Creole languages which use French loanwords in Montreal. The mixing of language in Montreal hip hop reflects a common element of street language, which involves what ethno-linguistics call crossing. Crossing is using languages in which individuals or rappers are not fluent, but they use kind of loan words to inject a kind of linguistic fluidity into their rap. Crossing has not only just linguistic kind of complexities, but also has a complex relationship to identity. So let's take the case of Quebec again. Urban Quebecers have integrated words from both Haitian, so things like popo to stand for police, or cob to stand for cash, as well as Jamaican Creole, using terms like rude boy or aggressive youth. And they incorporate these into everyday language and rap regardless of their own ethnic backgrounds. In a study by Sakar and Allen, a Haitian rappers in Montreal felt free to speak and use Creole even when they didn't identify as Haitian. In their study, rappers claimed that rather than these kind of language mixes actually alienating listeners, they enabled them to relate to a broader kind of ethnic diversity. Crossing is similar but different from code switching. Code switching includes not just language, but modes of dressing, walking, and other patterns of social behavior. This kind of code switching is common in Africa, which has a long history of colonial influences from French, Portuguese, Spanish, and English. In Tanzanian hip hop culture, for example, there's a kind of two-way cultural flow as Tanzanian youth draw on a range of different local and global resources or codes and draw them into their rap lyrics. For example, there's a development of a new kind of street Swahili, which also incorporates African American English terms as well as terms from Portuguese to develop a kind of new language that's unique to hip hop in Tanzania. Similarly, in the Nigerian context, hip hop artists have used a variety of linguistic strategies to construct a kind of local identity within the global hip hop movement. For instance, artists use Yoruba, English, and Pidgin with Igbo borrowings, as well as English Pidgin and Pidgin and Igbo kind of combinations throughout their rap. So here's an example from Weird MC, one of his songs where he is using a combination of Yoruba as well as English as well as Pidgin, all in a series of lyrics. So these kind of global hip hop genres require listeners to be kind of multilingual and to understand a lot of different languages simultaneously. So I want to stop and take a moment to listen to one of these kind of global sounds by Kanon in a song called Soba. Soba. So Kanon is this kind of global example of a kind of international hip hop star who bridges hip hop and African inspiration uh, and really kind of we can think of him as a bit of a cosmopolitan if we think back to our previous lectures. So if you're watching this on on YouTube, I'm not gonna play the song. I'll move past it. But if we're watching this in class, we'll play the song and have a bit of a discussion about it. But to give you some context, this song Soba was written about Kanan's experience in Somalia, where he's originally from before he emigrated to Canada, and talking about the kind of violent rival warlords and the need to kind of um, It's a kind of an inspirational song that is about lifting up the spirits of his fellow Somalians. So I'll move past that for the recording and talk a little bit about language remixed. So, one thing that has also clearly emerged from these accounts of kind of global hip hop flows is the constant way in which artists are mixing, borrowing, shifting, and sampling music, languages, lyrics, and ideas from one another. This process can include borrowings and imitations of African American English, as in, for example, Too Fat's lyrics shown here. So Too Fat here uses African American styled lyrics, and but they also kind of bring in other kind of references to globalization. For example, they talk about this kind of consumers' cultural products like M3s. They are, but they are also at the same time distancing themselves from this kind of consumerist world through their insistence that hip hop is about connecting MCs across time and space rather than just about this kind of wealth or bling culture. In other instances, rappers create these kind of bilingual flows or use mixed languages. For instance, Ghost 13 uses a combination of Tagalog, Cebuano, English, and Zambogueno, as well as Spanish. So, Zambogueno in particular is a kind of mixed Filipino, Spanish, Creole language that is common throughout the Philippines. So Ghost 13 clearly takes pride in their version of this kind of Creole language, which like other Creole languages has often been kind of derided as being not proper ways of speaking. But for Ghost 13, the use of this Creole language is central to their hip hop identity, and they use this language as a way to elevate it and make it more visible on a kind of international scene. The use of Creole in rap can be a sign of street credibility and of local authenticity. Since Creole languages are often viewed as kind of non standard local languages, their very use also provides an avenue for taking a kind of oppositional stance in terms of language politics. Most Creole languages are tied to things like slavery, colonialism, migration, and the African diaspora. So the use of Creole and other languages by groups like Ghost 13 is part of an explicit challenge to dominant national forms of identity. And it also evokes this kind of complex history of imperialism, colonization, and globalization. So that we can think about hip hop as a kind of driver of linguistic diversity, both in terms of the different languages that are used within the genre, as well as the way in which the genre itself creates new linguistic combinations. Linguistic and cultural flows can also intersect with domains like religion. For example, the popular culture manifestation of Islam and music produced by British and French musicians of Islamic background. In a 2001 study, ethnomusicologist Ted Swindenberg argued that the French rap group IAM engages with Islam in part in order to increase tolerance for Arab Islamic culture in France. The group uses Arabic words and expressions as well as musical mixes, and their songs are splattered with Middle Eastern rhythms and samples from Arabic songs. In the article that you guys read for today by Christina Higgins, she talks about the use of African American English as part of this kind of global hip hop nation. And she brings up the issue here of whether the use of AAE by Tanzanians and others is part of a kind of cultural appropriation or rather just linguistic crossing. So if you're at home, I'd love to for you to write down some ideas here. If you're in class, we'll talk about this question in small groups. Uh, Kind of going back to these religious flows, Swindenberg also has shown that the British band Fundamental has engaged with Islam in order to instill a kind of religious ethnic pride among Asian youth, to really use this language to combat racism, anti Arab racism, and to create links between Asians and Afro Caribbeans. They also hope to use their music to help educate white leftists and alternative youth about the core aspects of Islam, rather than to, as a way to kind of correct um, widespread perceptions of Islam that are kind of circulating in traditional media. So, in a totally different context, Malay rappers Too Fat saw both a spiritual and commercial opportunity in developing rap with lyrics from the Quran in Arabic. They have a song called Alhamdulillah, which was originally conceived as an R&B thank you. The title of the song is a word from the Quran that means praise be to God. And the group had Yasin, an Arabic singer, do the lyrics for the hook. The song itself is largely a critique of materialist values, with thanks to Allah for the gifts they had received. The song got great airplay in across Malaysia, where people never thought a rap song could have Quran lyrics and Arabic lyrics in it. So rap becomes this space for actually breaking down genres, cultural genres, and mixing across like religious um, doctrines and a broader hip hop culture. The language of hip hop also makes possible connections along class lines, not just religious ones. For example, MC Yan from Hong Kong uses predominantly colloquial Cantonese rather than common kind of mixed Cantonese English code words. By defying these kind of linguistic taboos of mainstream middle class society, MC Yan communicates his political message of linking Hong Kong slang and working class defiance with a broader kind of defiant underclass, which was critical to the emergence of hip hop in the US and more broadly. In conclusion, mixing and sampling is a significant element of hip hop culture, extending not only to the use of sound samples and different backing tracks, but also to the use of different instruments and the mixing and sampling of languages. Just as lyrics may oppose social orthodoxies, the use of multiple languages may be a purposeful act that's used in opposition to dominant linguistic practices and which creates new possibilities for language use and identity. That's all I have for you guys today. The answer to the D2L quiz is that Timbuktu is green. Make sure to fill that out, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday, where we'll enter our last module about climate change and tourism.